Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you tonight. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Janet Winans, and I am the acting president of the League for the next few months. And so I get to stand up here and introduce you to what is going to be going on tonight. Before we get to our very important speakers and the subject that they are going to be addressing, I have some announcements of my own. One is, for those of you who know what our They Represent You flyers are, the try is at the back table. There are copies that you can pick up to take. This is the listing of every one of our elected officials in the state of Washington and our national representatives. So it lists all of the contact information that you need to talk to them personally.
How about do our speakers each have one?
You know, I have one. In fact, we called in a correction, Joan. All of the city council candidates are up for election in 2015. So make sure you notice that. It says 2015 and 17, but they'll all be up in 2015.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh my.
It's confusing. Amendment 19 was confusing.
Okay, well, one of the good things to know is also this is online. And so while it will be not easy for us to erase that in the currently printed ones, it will be changed for the online edition. Also, tonight we are, the first Thursday of almost every month, we have a forum here. And next month, we will be having our agriculture study forum. The National League of Women Voters has organized and researched in a very detailed examination of what agricultural policy and needs are in the country. That study is available to anyone who would like to read it. We have it online, but our focus for our forum will be food safety and labeling. So we will have speakers dealing with those two particular issues here on the first Thursday of March. In addition to that, we are going to be having two separate ballot measures dealing with how we pay, first of all, for our transportation system in the county, and also how we will pay for our parks in the city. And at this point in time, neither of the forums are scheduled. I mean, we don't have the date or the place that those will take place, but we will be having an information forum dealing with the issues in each of those measures that we all will decide whether we will vote yes for the funding package or no. So please pay attention to any kind of the communication process that you get through the League. We will use Constant Contact to tell you the exact information for that. Also, we will be making every effort at publicity so that people do know about those two forums. The third issue is that we will be having our spring fundraiser on the 28th of May. That is going to be a breakfast at the Westin Hotel in downtown Seattle. Our goal is it will be soon after all of those people filing to run in the 2014 election will have completed their registration process. They will not yet be up and roaring with their campaign. We're going to have a breakfast and invite them to come and interact with each other before they set out as opposition to each other, and have what we hope will be a really interesting and enjoyable speaker who will be able to be amusing about the situation that we go into as we begin our political horse race at full tilt. So that is on the 28th. We especially want league members to think about how you can most help us in getting this put together. So there will be opportunities to volunteer to serve on the various essential task-doing committees. Again, pay attention and think, this is something I'd be interested to do. Right now, I'd like to introduce Mark Panett, who is going to be the moderator for our evening. We're very pleased to have Mark. Mark has done something that I confess I wish had happened in my life, and there are some others of us that might think the same thing, and that is that he is the husband of a very loyal league member and became interested in his subject enough, and also, I think, valued us enough to say that he'd like to be a member too. So he joins the cadre of very dedicated male members of the League of Women Voters. And we are very happy to have all of you who are here tonight and welcome your friends at the next one. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Janet. Tonight, we'll be looking at gun safety from a mental health and public health perspective. We'll also touch on current state law and the effects of I-594 and 591 on existing law. Our speakers tonight include Pete Holmes, Seattle City Attorney, Amnon Schoenfeld, Director, King County Mental Health, Chemical Abuse and Dependency Services Division, and Dr. Karen Millman, Prevention Division Director, Public Health, Seattle and King County. 78% of the gun deaths in Washington State are suicides. Many of you may know someone who has committed suicide with a firearm. I happen to know 5. I was reflecting on what to say to this forum, and the first 2 of these suicides really hit close to home for me. The first happened when I was a freshman in high school. A kid I had gone to grade school with was our class president. He was a year younger than we were, and he killed himself with a shotgun. The next 3 happened during my junior year at the Coast Guard Academy. 2 of them involved underclassmen, and 1 involved a officer who was also a professor at the academy. The last one was a friend of mine in high school who I lost touch with after graduation. He became a county sheriff in a suburb near Portland, and when I was home on leave, I read in the paper that he had shot his wife and then turned the gun on himself. All 5 of these suicides involve issues that will be talked about tonight. Universal background checks are only part of the solution. Promotion of gun safety education and putting more resources into mental health are also critical pieces. And now our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Karen Millman, Prevention Division Director, Public Health, Seattle and King County. Dr. Millman runs programs within the Prevention Division that include chronic disease and injury prevention, communicable disease control, epidemiology, and immunization services, HIV/AIDS, and STD prevention and control. You do have a long list, don't you?
Yeah, I didn't realize that was part of that.
Prior to assuming this multifaceted role, Dr. Millman was Director of Public Health and Health Officer for Nevada County, California, a rural county northwest of Sacramento. She led a full range of public health department services and served as the medical director for clinical services. Dr. Millman received her medical degree from the University of Maryland and a Master of Public Health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Millman.
Do you want me to go up there or sit here?
You can come up here.
Okay.
You might have better luck with this microphone.
All right, I'm going to try make sure I don't have any technical difficulties. Can everyone hear me okay?
Excellent. Before I get started, I wanted to convey a greeting to all of you tonight as well from Executive Dow Constantine. When I told him that I was coming here to speak tonight, he was very enthusiastic and wanted me to express his appreciation for your attention to this issue and to the many other issues that you work on, and to express his commitment to working on gun violence prevention at a local level. So as was just mentioned, I'm the director of the Prevention Division, and that relates to gun violence prevention in two sections that we have. The first is that we house the medical examiner's office. So unfortunately, we are the ones who see all of the fatalities that come through King County. And the other is that we have the Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention Program, in which our gun violence prevention program sits. And I just would like to point out Winnie Taylor over there is actually our program manager for our gun violence prevention program. And so, am I on with the slides, or did we go to sleep? Yeah, can we wait? I brought slides, which, yes, this is show. I love numbers, and I also know that I am not always good at hearing numbers. And so when I'm talking about a lot of numbers, I feel that it's really helpful to have visuals. And so I will be giving some numbers, but hopefully the pretty graphs will help make it all clear. I know we had it up there earlier. It's actually not up. Was there about... Let's see if we can get the remote control to work. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our local data and firearm ownership in King County, and then really get into what is a public health approach and what are some of the current activities that are being done both at the Public Health Department and with some of our partners and throughout the state to work on gun violence prevention. I was actually speaking earlier with someone about the issue of data collection. There has been a federal restriction on using federal money for gun violence research or prevention research, as well as a lack of money for gun violence prevention research, which has made this very difficult, in addition to which there are privacy laws that prevent law enforcement agencies from sharing some of their data, and there's no standardized method of collecting information, even from certain law enforcement scenes, for how they're collecting and saving the data about what's going on with guns. So it makes this job a little difficult, but I will tell you what we do know. In King County, more people die from gun violence each year than by automobile crashes. That means there are about 130 people each year. In my talk today, I'll talk to you a little bit, and you'll hear elsewhere people referring to the analogy between gun violence and traffic safety. And the reason we do this is twofold. One is because some of the interventions are the same, and also because automobile safety is an area that we've had a lot of success using a public health approach. And so it's just a way of illustrating some of the ways that we've done things in the past that could be applied to this. So as you just heard mentioned, in King County, firearms deaths are divided into different categories. And when you're thinking about this, we realize that although we think gun violence is one issue, it's really multiple different issues that are all involving the same mechanism. In public health, we tend to divide this by intent. And so about 1/3 of the firearm fatalities in King County are due to homicide, and 2/3 of them are due to suicide. And very few of them are actually due to unintentional injuries. Of note, the reverse of this trend is true for children, and more homicide victims are children than suicide victims of children. So the way this looks out, for every 100,000 people in King County, there are approximately 2 firearm homicides each year. And when we look at this, that rate is a little bit higher than it is for Washington State, but it's lower than it is for the rest of the country. And in fact, after you adjust for race and age, your probability of being murdered with a firearm in King County is 35% lower than it is in the rest of the country. And so we would think that would be good news, but unfortunately, firearm homicides don't affect everyone equally. And men, especially young men, are far more likely to die from a firearm than women. And most victims of firearm violence are men between the ages of 20 and 24, not just in King County, but across the country. And African Americans are far more likely to be killed by firearm than any other racial or ethnic group. This is also true for African American children. Gun violence also doesn't affect our neighborhoods equally. The firearm homicide rates in South and Central Seattle and parts of South King County are significantly higher than they are in the rest of the county. In fact, they're as much as 20 times higher than they are in the East Side counties, the East Side cities. When we look at suicide, which makes up 2/3 of all of the firearm deaths in King County, we know there are about 5 suicides for every 100,000 people in King County. And these rates are actually lower than they are in the rest of the country. Like homicide, suicide affects different groups of people differently, and it affects men more than it affects women. And particularly adult men are 8 times more likely to be the victim of a firearm suicide than adult women. These rates are higher in older men, and they're higher in whites and American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Another thing to note, which I'll get to more details later, is that the risk of a youth firearm suicide is 9 times higher in a home where the gun is not stored locked. When we look at the map of where firearm suicides across all ages are occurring in King County, we see that this is quite a different map. You'll see that before we had Seattle, which was bright red, where most of the firearm homicides are. But here, it's actually the more rural areas where we have more chances of having a firearm suicide. And when we look across other countries, youth in the US, young men and women, are 9 times more likely to commit suicide with a firearm than they are in other countries. Our suicide rates aren't that different. It's the mechanism of using a firearm. Fortunately, in King County, we do not have a lot of unintentional firearm fatalities. There were only 2 between 2006 and 2010, but there are a number of hospitalizations that occur, and there were 84 that occurred in this same time period. And just like with this trend that we noticed with suicides and homicides, men are far more likely to have a firearm injury than a woman. We'd really like to know where these guns are coming from and how people are accessing them and how they get involved in these events. But unfortunately, that's something that we don't have a lot of information about because there isn't a good tracking system. So what we do know comes from these health surveys that we could do across the entire population. And based on those health surveys, we know that approximately 1/4 of all homes in King County have a firearm in them. These surveys ask people, how do you store your firearm? And the good news is that about 63% of people who have a firearm in their home are storing them unloaded and locked. But approximately 1 in 7 homes in King County has a firearm that is not stored locked. We calculate that this means that there are about 5,000 children in this county that live in a home where there's a firearm that is stored loaded and unlocked. This is really concerning. Researchers have shown that homes that have a firearm in them are more likely to have a homicide take place there, and that these deaths that occur are 12 times more likely to be the death of a friend or a family member rather than a stranger. And when we looked at the youth firearm suicides in King County, in 80% of them, we could identify where the gun came from. And almost all of them, it was either a gun that was owned by that youth or owned by a family member. So the question is, what do we do about this? And you'll hear over and over again, we say, let's use a public health approach. Let's change how we're framing things. What do I mean by that? The Institute of Medicine defines public health as what we as a society do collectively to ensure the conditions in which people can be healthy. And so what that means is that we're not just saying this is what government needs to do to create regulations to change the situation, but it's our collective responsibility to take action to change not just the rules and regulations, but the environment and what we consider as acceptable normal behavior. There are 4 characteristics of a public health approach. The first is that it's data-driven and science-based. As I told you, I like numbers, so it makes sense that we'd like to have everything have data and to look at the evaluation of it. The other is that it's prevention focused. Public health likes to look upstream and prevent things from happening, not just work on mitigating events and injuries before they happen. And we look across populations, not just individuals. What is occurring in these groups? What is occurring in South King County that is different than in North King County that's increasing the risk of a firearm homicide there? And finally, public health recognizes that there is no one magical solution. Everything we do is multifaceted. So we want to have things that promote awareness and education. We also want to change our systems and change our policies about it. An example of this, again, goes back to traffic safety. We didn't just say everyone should be aware that you need to drive more safely. We had automobile makers make cars more safely so that they had to have, by requirements, safety belts and airbags. And we started building safer highways, and we also changed what the rules were with driving and had law enforcement enforce things more with graduated driver's licenses and more restrictions on drunken, that's a hard word to say, drunken driving. And we also did public health awareness campaigns, so people started to grasp the concept of a designated driver and really start to tell people that this is not acceptable normal behavior. It was all of these combined efforts that decreased traffic fatalities by 90% from 15 to 20 years ago to today. We can do this same thing with gun violence prevention. So as I mentioned, a public health approach is data-driven. I think there's some copies of some of the reports. I know Whitney has some of them with him, but I believe in one of your brochures. Last winter, we put together a report on gun violence in King County, which showed a lot of the statistics. And then over the summer and early fall, we did a review of every child firearm fatality over the past 14 years in King County, and that's where a number of the statistics that I told you about are. These reviews look at each child death and say, what are the risk factors and where's the chance to prevent something so we can come up with some trends. Unfortunately, these reviews are limited by law to people under 18 because that's where our privacy protections are. So we're working to try to figure out how can we extend these reviews to people between 18 and 30 because that's the group that is the most affected by gun violence. There are also other data efforts that are going around. I know some of you knew that the City Council funded the Harborview Injury Prevention Research Center to do some research on this. What they are doing is they are looking at hospitalization data and saying if you're in the hospital because of a firearm-related injury, what are the things that would have predicted you're getting there? So they're looking across data sources to try to figure out where we can intervene to prevent people from arriving in the hospital. Another thing that Harborview is doing is they're looking at using motivational interviewing. So youth who end up in the hospital with a traumatic injury, they do interviews with them to try to get them to decrease their risk behaviors, specifically carrying weapons. And they've had significant success with using this technique to get these youth to not carry weapons and the data that they've seen has tracked these youth over a year and shown that they have a huge reduction. And that's a paper that's going to be published later this spring. So that's pretty exciting information to see how we can implement this. We're also working towards something called NVDRS. See if we can get there. NVDRS is the National Violent Death Reporting System, and this is a system which collects data from existing sources and links it across a case so that you can really tell where the trends are and where there are commonalities that we wouldn't see by looking at only the law enforcement data by itself or only the medical examiner's information by itself. It's a federal system, and right now there are only 18 states that are doing this. But the good news is in February, with the 2014 Omnibus budget appropriation, President Obama put in there to expand it to a number of other states, and we, Public Health in Seattle and King County, are working with the Washington Department of Health to apply to make sure that Washington State is one of the groups that expand it next. And this is something we could certainly use your advocacy to help promote. This is really useful because not only will it look at firearms, but it will also look at all violent deaths, so other causes that we would want to look at preventing would be helpful to get the information for this. Another thing I mentioned is that public health always takes a prevention approach. The data that we had when we did the child death reviews for all the fatalities for 14 years showed that storage was a problem and a risk factor for suicide. When we say safe storage, we say what we're referring to is that a gun needs to be stored unloaded and locked, and the ammunition has to be kept separately. So once we have that information, what we did was we've launched a campaign called Safe Storage Saves Lives. It's a bit hard to say, but it gets the point pretty quickly across. We have partnered with 12 retailers so that when they are selling firearms, they are giving out information about the importance of storing firearms safely, and they are also giving discounts on the safes when people are referencing the campaign so that people will be more encouraged to purchase the firearm. We also are partnering with law enforcement agencies, and 25 of the agencies in King County have agreed to sign on, and they are giving out our information at community events. And most importantly, they are giving it out at their department when people come in to apply for a concealed pistol license. So the King County Sheriff's Office has set it up so they've trained all the people that when you come in and you want to apply for your pistol license, when they start to fingerprint you, they educate you on the importance that if you're going to have a firearm, you need to store it safely. And they fill out, I believe, hundreds of applications in the King County Sheriff's Office a week. So we're really trying to get this message out there. The other thing about a public health approach is that we try to look at policy options, because policy options really have a broad impact and they're lasting change. There are a number of bills that are in the Washington State Legislature this season. We'll talk about the two House initiatives. Some of these bills, particularly gun sales background checks, will probably help prevention. We're very positive about them. And others of them are bills that we are a little bit more concerned about the impact that they will have on access to and carrying of firearms. So it's something I would encourage all of you to be aware of and to monitor. I'm sure you're all aware that background checks are a very common sense action that we can take, but what you may not know is that they're actually proven to be effective. In Colorado, when they implemented the universal background check requirement this past summer, so that included all online sales and all private sales, not just gun shows. Since then, they have had almost over 4,700 background checks on private sales, and of these, 72 sales were blocked because of the would-be buyer had a record of some kind that would not allow them to have a firearm. We also have other research that shows death rates related to firearms in places that do local background checks. And in states that have local background checks requirements compared to other states, there's a 27% lower firearm suicide rate and a 22% lower firearm homicide rate. So this is pretty impressive information to show that this is an important step that we can take for gun violence prevention. A public health approach, as I've just explained, is quite complex, and it can take time to get to, but it should be really encouraging to know that we've had success with this with tobacco, we've had success with this with automobile safety. It's just a matter of sticking with it and getting everyone to take place in working on it. So I have hope that we can move together to make King County a safer place for all of our residents. And I think we're going to pass it on and ask questions later. Yes. Thank you. That's a lot of information in 15 minutes or less.
Thank you, Dr. Millman. Our next speaker will be Amnon Schoenfeld, Division Director, King County Medical Health, Chemical Abuse and Dependency Services Division. Amnon Schoenfeld has been working to improve people's lives for over the past 30 years and is now helping prepare future School of Social Work graduates to do the same. In his role as directing King County's Mental Health, Chemical Abuse and Dependency Services Program, he works with private and public agencies to improve the quality of their services and focus on recovery-based care. Now, Mr. Schoenfeld is leading a partnership with the School of Social Work to establish a new chemical dependency recovery certificate program. We have a huge need for chemical dependency professionals and mental health professionals, he said. There are a lot of opportunities right now in this field. Mr. Schoenfeld was recently honored with the prestigious Governor Booth Gardner Mental Health Champion Award at South Mental Health's annual fundraising gala. Mr. Schoenfeld.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight I want to share my perspective on the relationship between violence and mental illness, and about the relationship between gun ownership and violence, both violence to others and suicide. And I want to emphasize that I'm speaking for myself tonight. I don't want to say that I'm speaking for King County. I'm retiring at the end of the month, so I'm free to say whatever I want. But I don't think that I will have anything that is going to be too radical that King County could not support. So let me start with this story. In 1999, a man named Buford Furrow walked into the Los Angeles Jewish Community Center and randomly fired 70 rounds with an Uzi semi-automatic weapon, wounding 5 people, pretty seriously wounding 5 people, including a 5-year-old boy, a 6-year-old boy, and a 16-year-old girl. Fortunately, none of them died. He then walked outside and shot and killed a mail carrier because he said the man had dark skin. This man, Buford Furrow, was from Washington State, and he had previously been committed in King County after he made threatening statements and appeared to be suffering from a mental disorder. Because he had been committed, he was legally barred from possessing firearms. He was also prohibited from possessing firearms under federal law due to a previous felony conviction. Despite the legal restrictions on his being able to possess any firearms, when he was arrested by police, he had in his possession an Uzi, 5 rifles, 2 pistols, 6,000 rounds of ammunition, and a flak jacket. He had driven down to Seattle to Los Angeles with the express purpose of finding a Jewish community center and shooting people. The Glock Model 26 that he used to commit the murder was purchased by Furrow from an unlicensed dealer at a gun show in Spokane, Washington. Therefore, no check on his criminal record or commitment record. Now, when tragedies like this happen, the attention of the media is usually on whether or not the person had a mental illness and whether that was the cause of the violence and whether the person had received treatment. And usually it's all focused on what's wrong with our mental health system. And that was true regarding this case. It certainly was also true regarding the mass shootings at Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, Aurora, Cafe Racer, and many others. So let me start by talking about the relationship between mental illness and violence, because there's a lot of stigma attached to this. First of all, the vast majority of people who have a mental illness are not violent. Even just considering people who have the most serious mental illness, schizophrenia, 84% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia will never be violent in their lives. At least 95% of all the violent acts committed in our society are committed by people who do not have a mental illness. Now, mental illness, when combined with substance abuse, does rank a little bit, it does increase the risk of violence, but it's only 9th. Mental illness combined with substance abuse is 9th among the top 10 predictors of future violence. Can you guess what the number one is? Being young, okay? Second, being male. So young men, and that's kind of what Karen was saying with her presentation. Previous history of violence, history of juvenile detention, divorce or separation in the last year, history of physical abuse, parental criminal history, and unemployment are all better predictors of future violence than mental illness, even mental illness combined with substance abuse. Alcohol and drug abuse are far more likely to result in violent behavior than mental illness by itself. People with no mental disorder who abuse alcohol or drugs are nearly 7 times as likely as those without substance abuse to be violent. And yet, in all the discussion we've had over all these violent episodes that we've seen in the last several years, I'm not aware of any policymakers at the state or federal level or among the media talking about needing to provide more access to drug and alcohol treatment. It's all about providing access to mental health treatment. We need to do both. People with mental illness are much more likely to be the victims of violence and much more likely to die of suicide than they are to kill someone else. In 2009, according to the Centers for Disease Control, there were 16,799 homicides in the United States, and a very tiny percentage of those involved people with mental illness. And that same year, there were 36,909 documented deaths by suicide, more than twice the number of homicides. So here's some facts about suicide and guns. Most suicide attempts occur with little planning during a short-term crisis. And the tragedy here is that they're often impulsive acts. But if someone uses a gun to carry out their suicidal impulses, they're much more likely to complete that suicide. 90% of people who attempt suicide, who survive, do not go on to die by suicide later. But if they use a gun, there's a 90% likelihood that they will die. And just the access to that gun it greatly increases the risk. More people use a firearm than every other method combined when it comes to suicide. Most non-fatal self-harm treated in emergency departments is from poisoning and overdose, cutting. Less than 1% of non-fatal attempts are with a gun. So we know that having access to firearms greatly increases the risk that someone who attempts suicide will die. Suicide statistics, though, are not what drive our policy discussions or the media attention. What people are most worried about are those very rare mass shootings in which mental illness may be involved. Despite the factual evidence that the great majority of people with mental illness are not a risk to hurt others, most policymakers agree that people who have been involuntarily committed by the court after having been found to be a danger to themselves or other people should not have access to guns. I think virtually everyone agrees with that. The NRA agrees with that. In fact, the NRA has advocated for laws that would restrict anyone who has a mental illness from being able to purchase a gun, not just having been committed, but who has a mental illness. So why is it that these same people oppose a law that would provide more safeguards to keep people who shouldn't have a gun from getting a gun? Here's some facts about access to firearms and what we do here in King County. Federal law, and Pete Holmes can tell you more about the laws here. Federal law requires that anyone who's been involuntarily committed by a court for psychiatric treatment is prohibited from possessing a firearm unless the person petitions the court to have the right to have a firearm reestablished. States are asked to send records of all people committed to a federal database, and they get some federal funds if they do so, but they can't be required to do so. I don't know whether the recent law has changed that in terms of the requirement, but most states don't do a very good job of sending that information. Only 30 states fully report, and Washington State is one of those. In fact, we're one of the best in the country. In King County, last year, we did over 50,000 background checks. Our office, our involuntary commitment office, we're asked to do background checks on 50,000 people by police departments all over King County. The state of Washington did 250,000 background checks. At the same time, what we had, and you've heard the statistics about the number of children under 13 killed by guns. 565 children under the age of 18 were murdered by firearms. Number who committed suicide using firearms, 749. The statistics go on and on. Over 1 million people have been killed with guns in the United States since 1968, when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. So, in conclusion, what we know about people with mental illness is that as a group they are not dangerous. There are risk factors, however, that do increase the small likelihood of violence among some people who have mental illness. When people don't have access to treatment, when they're homeless, when they feel hopeless, when they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, the risk of violence is increased. We have to address those risk factors. That's the public health approach. We have to provide mental health and substance abuse treatment that meets their needs so they're more likely to accept the treatment. We have to provide safe, affordable, supportive housing. And we have to give them access to job training and education so that they feel like they're part of our society and contributing to our community. And most importantly, we need to give them support and hope and respect. We have to turn around the 2/3 of people in this country who have said in a survey last year that they wouldn't want to work with or live near anyone who has a mental illness. As President Obama proposed in his plan to reduce gun violence, we need to have a national conversation to increase our understanding about mental health. The single most important thing that we can do to reduce the risk of violence among those small number of people who are at risk is to confront and end the stigma surrounding mental illness, and I would add the stigma around substance abuse, and make it easier for people to accept and understand their illness and to get the treatment they need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schoenfeld. Our next and last speaker is Pete Holmes, Seattle City Attorney. Mr. Holmes is in his second term as Seattle City Attorney, having run opposed in the 2013 election. 2012, he received the annual Ansel Payne Civic Leader of the Year Award from Washington Cease Fire for showing consistent courage and purpose in efforts to reduce gun violence in the state. Specifically, he continued the city's efforts to ban guns from the area's parks, community centers, and other facilities where children are likely to be present. When the courts invalidated the ban, Pete began and continues to lobby for it in the legislature. The notion that Seattle can't protect its most vulnerable residents on the city's own property is inimical to the principles of local autonomy. Every Washingtonian should be alarmed that state law has been interpreted to prevent such reasonable, common-sense local controls. Pete worked as a private attorney in Seattle for almost 25 years before he was elected city attorney in November 2009. He was an original member of the Seattle Police Department's Office of Professional Accountability Review Board and served as chairman from 2003 to 2008. There he championed the public release of police records and OPARB reports. As city attorney, he has worked to make this office more transparent. He is a member of the state Sunshine Committee. Pete graduated from Yale College in 1978 with a BA degree in American Studies and a concentration in Energy and Environmental Sciences. He worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. before entering the University of Virginia Law School, where he earned his JD in 1984. Mr. Holmes.
Thank you much. If that introduction gave you any indication, I think I want to balance the science and mental health professionals that have talked about the problem and provide some of the insights into what the law and the politics around gun violence is in our state. First, I thoroughly embrace and agree that we need to approach the problem of gun violence, especially with suicides, as a public health problem. And there is no doubt in my mind that that is, of course, the number one reason why the NRA had so ardently opposed any effort at gathering epidemiological data so that would show and demonstrate the problems that are created when we have guns in our homes. I remember, as a parent assistant, taking our children out on the Oregon Trail and learning even back when we were settling this area that the number one cause of death on the Oregon Trail was from firearm-inflicted wounds, particularly with family members, not from hostile natives, not from armed robberies or anything like that, but when, for instance, a family member would reach in to pull the loaded gun out of the wagon and then would then shoot themselves, essentially. It was kind of a harbinger of things to come. We learned that from history. And, of course, Mark Twain, my favorite author, perhaps, said that, more people have been killed with an unloaded gun than any other weapon in history. But we can joke about it, and the sad truth is that we are on the horns of a dilemma with the political discourse in this country, whether we're talking about social justice or even balancing a budget. It's very difficult sometimes to just have an honest and sane debate. As he mentioned, I'm on the State Sunshine Committee, and just a few months ago, I had the temerity to bring up, I guess I should say the Sunshine Committee is charged with reviewing all of the exceptions to public disclosure. The law says that every public record is yours to see because it's a product of the government and you have a right to see it, unless it's subject to an exception. Well, one of those exceptions is for applications for concealed pistol licenses. And I brought that up in a recent meeting and suggested that we debate it and decide whether or not that exemption should be continued. And up until then, I had never crossed swords with Senator Pam Roach, another member of. So I was starting to worry, the reason, that I hadn't, kind of suffered from her ire, but that one resolved all doubt. And I'm sorry to say that we could not even debate whether or not that exception should survive. I was pleased looking at some of the maps that you had, Doctor, that I'm from the 98118 zip code, and while it had a red area for the homicides, it was very low on suicides. And yet, I think that there's so much that we can do. The mental health aspect of this, we're hoping to approach as, Omnin knows full well what resources and what lack of resources we have, even in wealthy King County, to help the mentally ill. But there are still some common sense things that I reflect on as now a grown man in Washington State. I grew up on the farm in Virginia where we actually found use in the NRA for hunter safety courses. I grew up, my mother and my youngest brother still live on the farm in central Virginia that I grew up on. And we had learned how to hunt from an early age. It was very much, you certainly brought home what you killed. It was not for trophy hunting, it was subsistence hunting. And the notion that anyone needed an assault weapon with a 30-round magazine was ludicrous. In fact, we had a law that where most automatic, semi-automatic shotguns and rifles that you would use for sporting purposes, purely sporting purposes, they would typically hold 1 round in a chamber and maybe 3 or 4 rounds in the magazine. But under state law, you could not have any more than 2 in the magazine, and if a if a wildlife official encountered you out on the hunt and found that you did not have that plug in there, not only were you fined and your weapon confiscated, but you were derided by the community. Why did you need all those extra rounds? And to think now, I'm not all that old, but to think that now we look at the right to have 30-round magazines and these fully automatic weapons that are capable of doing such carnage when they do get into the hands of someone that has a serious mental health problem in a mass murder situation. To me, it's amazing that we find ourselves incapable of having a civil discourse on that. In the state of Washington, we tried under former Mayor Nichols to ban weapons in parks and playgrounds where families with children would frequent. It was that limited. And under my term, we had taken it all the way up to the Washington Supreme Court and lost. And I want you to know it's not a matter of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It's state law. It's state law. It's state law that's not even state constitutional law. It's law that they could change this session down in Olympia if only they decided that municipalities like Seattle, like Moses Lake, whatever, should have their own right to decide where guns can be carried and displayed. And when you compare our state's laws to even other states, in the state of Washington, you can have a loaded gun in your possession while you're drunk. You cannot in the state of Texas. It is illegal. And so why we have problems with that kind of a rational debate is one of the things that, and this is a sympathetic crowd, but still we have to understand why, when you look back at that map, why the suicide rates are so high out in those rural areas, and why the homicide rates may be higher here in the urban areas, but lower suicide rates. It's the access to guns, it's all of these other issues that we're trying to just at least give us the data to try and understand this better. And so I'm fully behind that. I'm very proud, by the way, Councilmember Burgess was the sponsor of one of the early studies where the city of Seattle contributed funds to actually start some of these studies at Harborview that was mentioned earlier. We've also stubbed our toe on a few measures, such as gun buybacks. And I won't comment except to say that we really do have to be very thoughtful and careful about when we're doing something because it's supported by the data, and when perhaps it's being done because maybe it's for a politically expedient cause, because certainly that's what the NRA is doing. And that brings us to the coming ballot. We have two initiatives on the ballot, as you know. 594, which I have endorsed and support and have worked hard on, is one that would require criminal background checks. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that a criminal background check is required when you buy from a federally licensed dealer. That's the law today. But if you buy from a private citizen, or if you go to a gun show where amateur hobbyists are displaying guns, or a garage sale, there is no background check required. Even when you sell your used car, you're supposed to, by law, report the sale to the next owner. You're supposed to report to the Department of Licensing the fact that the title has transferred, but not in the case of guns. And so that's what 594 would do, is to make sure that we are tracking for every sale, that we would require even private sales to conduct a criminal background check. And they would do that through the NICS system. It's called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS. And Washington does participate in that. So I want to leave some time for questions. I'm not sure how much interest people have in some of the nuances of this, but I wanted to just chat on a few things. Recently we had the city library relaxed its ban on guns, and there was a lot of criticism for that, which I thought was pretty much unfair. In fact, it was a direct result of our loss, the city's loss in the Washington Supreme Court on the Chan versus City of Seattle case. It was clear after a number of public records requests that the public library, which had probably the most strict ban on firearms in any city library, that they were about to be sued by a gun rights group, and they would almost certainly have lost and had to pay damages. And it was, I think, something that they did very reluctantly and after a great deal of deliberation. But it is another reflection, I think, on the state of the law in the state of Washington, not the federal Constitution. And in case anyone wondered, the U.S. Supreme Court has said under the Second Amendment to the Constitution that gun regulation is permitted under the Second Amendment. It's the absolute prohibition of guns, banning as in Chicago, when Chicago tried to do that, that is prohibited by the Second Amendment. I disagree with a lot of that jurisprudence, but nonetheless it is the law as articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court. There's one thing that scholars are starting to look at, and this is the history buff in me, and I'm hopeful that one day we will have more clear knowledge, but I thought I'd leave you with an example of how I think history repeats itself. There's a lot of evidence, when you look at an NRA sign or a slogan, they never quote the preamble to the Second Amendment, right? It's always the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? But anyone know the preamble? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the state. And we're pretty sure, most scholars believe, that what they meant by the well-regulated militia? Runaway slave militias. It was when the Articles of Confederation failed, and we then tried to get a stronger central government, that we passed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And the Second Amendment was probably designed to make sure that key southern slaveholding states would come into the Union. So I think that when we stop and reflect on the possible historical antecedents to the Second Amendment and find ourselves today unable to have a civil discourse, it kind of sheds some light into some of the challenges ahead. Nonetheless, I think it's something that we have to do. The old farm boy from Virginia, who would have never thought about having more than 2 rounds in that chamber, I think that there is a way that we can restore sanity, and I do think that it is the public health approach. The fact that you're all here tonight to talk about probably one of the gravest public health issues facing us today is a testament to that. So I say stay strong. Thank you all for being here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I have one question to start off, an easy one. What happens if both 591 and 594 pass? Which I think is quite possible.
I'm having coffee with Bob Ferguson tomorrow. We have a few things that we're trying to talk about, whether it's I-502 and the right of local jurisdictions to ban marijuana facilities, or in this case, the press release that came out a few weeks ago from the Attorney General's office. So let me read it to you. This possibility has come up before, but Washington voters have not simultaneously passed conflicting or potentially conflicting initiatives. So the subject has never come before the courts. The Attorney General's office published a formal opinion on this issue in 1993 when Initiative 601 and 602 were on the ballot, if you remember those. 601 ultimately passed. Although there is still no established rule of law in our state on how to resolve the issue, the opinion discusses how a conflict between two initiatives might be resolved if both were to pass. Now, you should know, I talked earlier about 594, which would require criminal background checks. 591, guess what? Says it prohibits background checks until federal law is changed. That is the Second Amendment Foundation sponsored initiative. If two conflicting initiatives pass, the first task would be to analyze whether they can somehow be reconciled. I don't think we can do that in this one. If not, there are a few possibilities. Again, this is from our Attorney General. Number one, it may be possible for the legislature to resolve any conflict by amending either or both measures, but it would have to be with a 2/3 vote. For the first 2 years after an initiative, it cannot be modified by the legislature except with a 2/3 vote of both houses. Or, second, the option is that the matter could be left for the courts to decide. And in some other states, not in Washington, the courts have resolved the conflicts by giving whatever measure passed by more votes, even a few votes, give that one precedent. So that is one possibility, but it's not limited. It could be an outcome under our state constitution. It's not prohibited. And as the Attorney General concludes, we cannot predict with certainty what approach the Washington courts would ultimately take.
Anybody have any questions? I'm curious about data collection. Are there any efforts to introduce some standardization across states and nationally?
So I can answer part of that.
Okay.
Certainly, what I mentioned, the National Violent Death Reporting System that we are hoping to become a part of is, in fact, an effort to standardize data. And what that is it takes information from law enforcement, from the medical examiner's office, from a variety of sources, and it codes them all in the same manner, not just for firearm fatalities, but for any violent deaths, so stranglings or accidents or anything else like that. So that is a public health effort to standardize data. I am not as familiar with the details of this, forgive me for it, but law enforcement is also working towards the National Incident-Based Reporting System that they're using, and I know that the Seattle Police Department is switching over to that at present, and that would be a standardized method. The challenge with that is you also have to collect the information, and that it is not always the information that we want from a public health standpoint is not always the same information that a law enforcement person is looking for when they're at the scene. So we sort of want to know where the gun came from, and they want to know who used the gun. So looking at those differences is another thing that we're trying to work on locally.
Is what you're working on, are there some people who should be contacted? What would you like to see in groups like this?
Well, I think we're not at a point yet where I would say, please knock on X person's door. We're still figuring out the logistics of what it will require, and also the big point is what are the resources required if we're going to be changing systems for how people are collecting data or how they're entering them. From my standpoint, as things move forward, we would certainly like support for getting Washington State to participate in the National Violent Death Reporting System. Oh no, I'm ready to seek support for that. I'm just saying, don't call any of our law enforcement captains and say, why aren't you collecting data on this thing quite yet? Because I think we're still trying to figure out what that would look like, and so let's have a chance to try to sort out the details.
Next question. How do Washington jurisdictions deal with confiscation of weapons, especially in the cases of domestic violence restraining orders?
Seattle does a pretty good job. We have, especially for domestic violence cases, our officers are really pretty good when they understand that a weapon has been used, especially a firearm, in an assault or in a threatened assault. They are under department policy and practice to actually confiscate the weapon. And typically, our prosecutors in my office would ask that the weapon be retained by law enforcement as a part of any order following a conviction, and certainly during the interim time when we have no contact orders in place. So we do a pretty good job in Seattle, but again, it's so varied by the violent situations that the officers encounter when they go into homes. These are one of the most intractable issues that you can imagine, and it's one of the reasons why I just wanted to add a quick plug that I think it should be beyond debate that we simply have too many guns in our society. We're awash in guns, and that means that unlike, say, England, where an argument might result in fisticuffs, here it's as likely that someone's going to pull out a gun and end it. And that's why suicides are far more successful here. It's one of those things where officers are encountering them all the time. They're hyper-vigilant about it, and we do try to make sure that we take firearms away from offenders, especially in these very dynamic domestic violence situations.
Follow-up on that. Are those who have a domestic violence restraining order, is that reported to the federal level? So it shows up on their database?
It is. And I'm just trying to find the exact, this is kind of begging the question about the Castleman opinion. That was, I know, one of the issues you were concerned about. We do normally report that, at least in Seattle, but there's a case pending now in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that is talking about the state of Tennessee's domestic violence laws. They do not have what's called a physical force element. Even though a spouse may have used a weapon to cause injury or threaten injury to his or her spouse, it doesn't contain a physical force element, and hence it's been argued that under if you're really following this, 18 U.S.C. Section 922 is the statute. So it's now been argued that Tennessee's law for misdemeanor domestic violence, use of a firearm, does not trigger the federal statute that would disqualify the offender from buying a weapon. The argument is that because the Tennessee statute doesn't include that physical force element, that it would not be included. And so the problem is, if that argument prevails, that's probably half of the state laws in this country do not have that element on domestic violence. So it's a scary proposition, and we're all watching it. And of course, then that would mean we'd have to go back to our state legislatures and insist that they put a physical force element into their state statutes, so that under federal law, a domestic violence perpetrator could not own a firearm.
Define physical force. What does that mean?
I don't know how you can cause physical injury without some physical force. So all I can tell you is those are the literal terms in the federal statute. Physical force has to be an element of the state law, and that's a direct quote from the statute.
Given the restrictions on the use of federal funds for research and data collection, are there any efforts to seek money from private philanthropic organizations?
So the question was, given the restrictions that have existed on federal funding being used for gun violence prevention research, are there any efforts underway to seek philanthropic or private funding? And I will say yes, and in fact, there are efforts underway to even receive public funding, as we have seen within the city of Seattle. The good news is that in his executive order and his efforts related to gun violence prevention, President Obama has eased some of the restrictions on using federal funding. It's quite intertwined. So for example, the ARA efforts, so you remember the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, that was several years ago. There were actually grants to that came out to public health departments and other health departments to do work to promote healthy eating. And all of those have little sidelines in them that actually specify this funding cannot be used for firearms research. So you have to actually, so this is funding to work on, let's prevent obesity. So you really have to read the fine print of all your federal grants to see that. I think that there is expanded funding that came out in the new budget for 2014 to the CDC to do violence and injury prevention research. It's just, there's not a lot. The data, we don't know who owns guns. There are no registries or any way of looking at that. So it's a long and slow process we're 30 years behind where we should be because of how long these restrictions have been in place.
Well, I know some states like Illinois require the reporting of the theft of a gun. Are there any laws like that in the state of Washington?
I confess I'm stumped. I don't believe there is. Most people would because they want a police report for insurance purposes, but I do not believe there is. Could I real quickly interject? I meant to talk earlier. You pointed out, Karen, how the Colorado success story. I just wanted, as a footnote on the political consequences, 2 Colorado legislators who voted for the new laws in Colorado were promptly recalled, and for doing nothing more than voting their conscience. No misappropriation of funds, no fraud, no any kind of moral turpitude crime, but simply voting for a bill to increase gun control. Good point.
Also in those cases, the voter turnout for those recall elections was extremely low. And if you're a fan of The Daily Show like I am, they did a very good bit on that. So, the confiscation of weapons where a gun is present but was not part of a domestic violence call. I guess this would be, say, someone was threatening their spouse with one weapon, but he's got 15 more in the closet. Do they confiscate all 15, or?
In Seattle, they will, if they know that there are more weapons. This goes to the definition of who has physical control over a weapon. And so an officer will know that if he has knowledge or she has knowledge that in a household there are other weapons and the perpetrator has access to them, then they are considered under both federal and state law to be in physical control of the weapon, and it will be seized if it's been used in an act of violence.
What things are being worked on or proposed to help the mentally ill get more support and help when they need it? I guess related to that, there seems to be some movement on the war on drugs, that lots of people are starting to say it's just not working on both sides. Is that having an impact in your area? I mean, as far as going to a treatment approach instead of let's lock them up?
So 2 questions.
Yes.
One was about what's happening at the state level regarding support for treatment for people with mental illness. And the next was are more policymakers kind of recognizing that the war on drugs isn't working. Let me take the second one first.
Okay.
I think there is an increasing perception that the traditional way that we've been dealing with drug abuse in our society has not worked. All the statistics show that, the data clearly show that, and we at least have 2 states that have done something about that and trying to decriminalize people who are using drugs that formerly were criminal acts. So I think I think we are starting to see a lot more discussion. President Obama has certainly been talking about it. We definitely have unequal treatment of people who are using drugs. It's interesting. We know that people who are minorities are arrested much more often for drug possession than white people. and that they're much more likely to get prison sentences. I think the recent death of a great actor, Philip Seymour Hoffman, of heroin addiction, an overdose, illustrates a lot. The reaction of the community I think, would have been very different. It's getting a lot of attention. People are starting to look at this as a health problem because our perception of that individual is different than our perception of most people who are addicted to heroin. And that kind of publicity may help us to get more of a public health response to what really is a medical problem. So, it's unfortunate that a tragedy has to happen to raise that awareness, but that's the kind of thing we need more of, is that kind of awareness that it's a public health issue. It should not be it's not going to be solved by just putting people in prison. As to the first point, we are facing actually a major crisis right now in our state. We're projected to lose another $23 million in state mental health funds starting July 1st. The legislature, when they passed their budget last year, it was a biennial budget, and the first year, we're in our first year of the biennial budget now, there was some reduction in mental health funds and substance abuse treatment funding. But the second year of the biennium, starting July 1st, big decreases in funding. And that's because the state thought that because of Medicaid expansion, we wouldn't need the state-only dollars to pay for treatment because everyone would be on Medicaid and they wouldn't need the state-only dollars to pay for treatment. That is a false assumption because what we're using those non-Medicaid state-only dollars for are services that cannot be paid for with Medicaid. And so we are facing major crisis. We already have a situation where 2/3 of all the people who are involuntarily committed in King County, we have no treatment beds for when we commit them. These are people that we have found to be a danger to themselves or others, and we have nowhere to put them. So we keep them wherever they are, an emergency room, whether that's Snoqualmie Valley Hospital or Evergreen Hospital, and the National Commission just found Evergreen Hospital had to change their practices because they weren't meeting federal standards. That's going to happen to more and more hospitals. We're boarding 30 and 40 people who have been involuntarily committed in hospitals every day in King County. And we need the state funds to be able to put people into appropriate hospital treatment. Beds are coming. We have hospitals that are opening new treatment beds. We won't be able to use them because we don't have the money to pay for the treatment in those psychiatric facilities. So we have a big problem. And let me add one other thing about what's going on in the legislature relating to guns. There was a hearing recently about a new law, change to the Involuntary Commitment Act, and it's being promoted by the parents of a young man who was shot and killed about a year ago by Seattle police. He had a gun, he was waving the gun and threatening people with the gun. He was shot and killed. The parents, the father was a former legislator in another state. They are promoting a law that would enable family members to petition the court to overrule a decision by a designated mental health professional not to involuntarily commit someone. And then the court could order the person to be detained. And they have said that if this law had been in effect at the time that their son was killed, he would be alive today. That's absolute, and I have great respect for the parents and what they're trying to do. I know is a horrible tragedy, but that is simply not true. He was committed. It's in the newspaper. It's been reported on TV. He was involuntarily committed. And the statement you may have seen in the papers that the parents said, which is you have to have a gun to your head before you can be committed, is absolutely untrue. We committed him. That is public knowledge. He was in Harborview for 2.5 weeks. He got out of Harborview because he was better, and then he stopped his treatment. And then he purchased, and here's the thing, they're trying to pass a law to change the commitment law. He had a gun. He purchased a gun after he had been committed. He's not allowed to have a gun after he's committed. We reported that to the state. It was in the database, and yet he got a gun. How did he get the gun? According to the newspaper, he got a gun from a wholesale dealer in Spokane. He was very adept at the internet. I know because I received emails from him. And he purchased something over the internet, most likely, because it didn't need a background check. So why aren't the legislators talking about background checks, which would have prevented this person from getting a gun and then being shot by police? That should be the issue, not changing the involuntary commitment law.
Thank you. I'll answer this one. It's a definition. What is a round? A round is a bullet. One for one. 30 round magazine would hold 30 bullets. Auto deaths are often compared to gun deaths. People are required to buy auto insurance. Could gun owners also be required to buy liability insurance? Do the insurance companies figure that into their rates?
Legal question.
I don't know if anyone can
I'm
answer
trying
that.
to remember if my homeowner's policy, I have to disclose whether I have weapons. I don't remember the answer to that, but we could require that. We require as a condition of doing business in the state, the state insurance commissioner, Michael Kreidler, can require that, for instance, people with high automobile risk, they're assigned rate, they're in the assigned rate pool, and insurance companies are required to provide insurance, minimum levels, and we could do this. I think it would be incredibly unpopular, and God knows what the expense would be. So it seems logical to me, but they're also talking about applying it in other circumstances, in buildings, so that you're kind of putting pressure on building owners to check and see whether guns are being stored there. There are lots of different ways that this might be applied. So we're all kind of scratching our head at this one.
It's for Dr. Millman. Is data collection on gun deaths and injuries allowed at hospitals? I believe the answer is yes, but
So there is a requirement that hospitals report, that there's a requirement actually in Washington State that hospitals report gun injuries that come into the emergency department. I don't believe, and this is my personal belief, so let me clarify that it is being very well enforced, because right now the way it is done is that similar to communicable disease reporting, they're supposed to, when a physician sees a patient with a gun injury, they are supposed to report something to the State Department of Health. That occurs on a sheet of paper, and right now that sheet of paper goes in a file. It is not electronic at all, which means that there is no way to really go through and actually do an analysis on the data unless we were able to have someone to take all those sheets of paper and enter them into a computer system to do the analysis. So what is available right now is something called CHARS, and so there is data from hospital admissions on all sorts of hospital admissions, not specific to firearms. And if someone is admitted to the hospital and their diagnosis at the time of admission is a firearm injury, then there is some data on that, and that is the information that is actually sort of the source for the initial work that Harborview is doing.
is there any data to indicate where the guns that the Seattle Police Department confiscates from a crime, where those guns came from? Are most of them originating in state, or are they imported from Oregon or Idaho?
I don't know.
Don't know?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
We have found in some of our discussions, the Public Health Department has been seeking data. So we've met with our law enforcement partners, we've talked with juvenile justice and other courts, and one of the agencies we have talked with is the ATF, and they have told us that they actually do not do a large amount of gun tracing because they do not have the resources for it.
Yes. No, ask away.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. I'm still trying to understand the open carry law. How did we ever get to open carry? That's the case. Why, despite your great efforts, did the Supreme Court support?
I am sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, the question, I'm sorry, was about open carry. What, I guess, the genesis, how does it still exist in a modern society? You know, it really is unnerving. At City Hall, you know, we're not on the list of special places that the state deems appropriate for, you know, a firearms ban, like a courthouse or a school. And so they regularly walk into City Hall where I work, you know, strapping a Glock 40 caliber. And it really is unnerving, especially after some of the comments I get online about different positions on, like, concealed pistol licenses and whether or not they should be exempt from public records. You know, we're a populous state. We still have lots of seeds of the Wild West. That's the only thing I can say. Try to get that repealed, and you will meet a brick wall in Olympia, a brick wall toting.
Yes.
Could Mr. Holmes comment on the link between the formation of the Second Amendment in the Constitution and the need or the desire of slave owners? What is the link there between
Well,
slave control and the Second Amendment?
Oh, just simply, if you remember your American history, we tried the Articles of Confederation, where most of the 13 colonies preserved a lot of their independence, and it was a very loose confederation, and that didn't, the central government wasn't strong enough. With Alexander Hamilton and Paine and others, the Federalist Papers, there was a renewed effort, and we then had the Constitutional Convention in 1789. But that didn't pass immediately. They couldn't get all of the colonies to sign until they amended and added the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And it's the Second Amendment that some scholars believe was done to appease slaveholding states. Because even then, we thought there was tension in the slaveholding states and those where slavery was not allowed.
And what was the motive? To control slaves?
You bet. I mean, let's face it, slavery is inherently coercive, and the runaway slave militias were very important. And so the well-regulated militia that's what some scholars believe.
We're going to have to wrap this up.
Another part to that militia term. If you know anything about the Civil War,
I grew up in Virginia, 19 miles from Appomattox.
you will recall that the terminology used was the Illinois Volunteers.
Sure.
And the Massachusetts Volunteers. The militia still existed. There was no national army, and the militia idea that was in the Constitution was still existent at the time of the Civil War. What you're saying is absolutely right, that it was not the only use of the militia.
Oh, you bet.
And that
I
has
agree.
been argued before the Supreme Court, by the way.
I agree.
All right. I'd like to thank our speakers and thank everyone for attending. And one last thing, someone wanted to know if you have a copy of your presentation.
I don't actually have a copy of my presentation, although
Maybe,
I do have a slideshow, and with your permission, I would post it on our website so people could look at it. Sure. If you're okay with that. Okay.
all right.
I also leave some cards if anyone wants them.
All right.